The Compact Council's emergency session opened at 700 hours on a Wednesday and lasted 11 minutes, which was the shortest emergency session in the Council's 67-year history and which was not, despite appearances, a sign of efficiency. The Velsorath conflict had been building for 14 months before the first shot was fired. It was a territorial dispute between two non-compact species in the outer ascending corridor, the Sarath Vel, who had been in the region for approximately 300 years and who had, since the medical contact 4 years ago, been developing a cautious relationship with the compact's ascending corridor presence, and a species newly designated in the survey database as the Theron Val, who had emerged from the far side of the ascending cluster and whose expansion pattern had brought them into conflict with Sarathvel territorial claims over 6 systems with habitable bodies. The compact had been trying to mediate for 11 of the 14 months. The mediation had not succeeded, because the Theron Val's decision-making structure was distributed in a way that made central agreements difficult to enforce at the regional level, and because the Sarathvel had a historical experience with territorial encroachment that made them skeptical of agreements that were not backed by demonstrated capability. The first shot was a Theron Val strike on a Sarathvel colony ship in transit between two of the disputed systems. The colony ship had 340 people on it. The strike was not a military action in the structured sense. It was more consistent with what the Compact's military analysts called an opportunistic territorial assertion, the kind of action that happened when a distributed decision-making structure had regional actors who moved faster than central coordination could manage. 340 people. The Compact's emergency session opened at 700 to address the conflict. The 11 minutes produced the following: a resolution condemning the strike, a call for immediate ceasefire, an authorization for the Compact's Observer Corps to deploy to the region, and a formal restriction on member species' unilateral military involvement in the conflict pending the Compact's mediation process. The restriction was explicit. It named no species specifically. It said, "No compact member species shall deploy military assets to the Velsorath conflict zone without compact collective security authorization." The restriction passed by 16 votes, with the human delegation abstaining and the Keth delegation voting against. The session ended. The restriction was in the record. The Compact's observer ships were dispatched. Ambassador Noah Marovazic sat in the council chamber after the session had ended and the other delegations had filed out and looked at the record on her display. 340 people on a colony ship in transit. The Sarathvel were the species whose 11 crew members Dr. Ilan Vasquez Osai had managed through post-suspension emergence in a cold derelict 4 years ago. The species who had given Ilan the name for the one who tends the injured, the one who knows the body's argument. The species whose captain had said, "We will remember that the Compact sent a vessel into the ascending direction before it was mapped, and that the vessel had someone who knew our bodies before they knew our names." They had not been in the Compact's area of the ascending corridor when that happened. They had been managing their own matters. The relationship had been built by contact, by the medical intervention, by the years since when the ascending corridor's commercial and diplomatic frameworks had gradually included them at the margins. They were not compact members. They were not under the Compact's protection. They were, in the language of the Compact's governance framework, a non-member species in a conflict zone, and the Compact's response was observation and mediation. Noah looked at the restriction. She thought about what was in the ascending corridor. She thought about Yilin Okonkwo's fleet, which had been at combat readiness in the ascending corridor for operational reasons unrelated to the Velsorath conflict, because the ascending corridor was the operational environment and combat readiness was the posture. and had been since before the conflict began. She thought about the Sarathvel colonies in the 6 disputed systems, and the Sarathvel vessels that were currently moving through a conflict zone without the kind of protection that the compact observer ships could not provide. She thought about the restriction. She thought the restriction says military assets. It says deploy. It does not say evacuate. It does not say humanitarian corridor. It does not say presence in the region because presence in the region was established before the restriction, and the restriction was a prohibition on new deployments. She was 20 years of compact governance experience looking at a document, and what she saw was what she always saw when she looked at documents: the architecture, the load-bearing elements, and the joints. She opened her notebook. She wrote 3 words: deploy military zone. She looked at what she had written. She called Yilin Okonkwo. Yilin was in the ascending corridor, at Relay Station Kappa 14, which was the operational hub for the ascending corridor's UEDF presence. She answered in under 5 seconds, which was her baseline, and her face had the quality of a person who had been watching the compact session feed and had been waiting for this call. Noah said the restriction prohibits deployment of military assets to the conflict zone without compact authorization. Yes, Yilin said. You are already in the ascending corridor, Noah said. You were in the ascending corridor before the restriction. Yes, Yilin said. The Sarathvel colony in the Vel Sarath 7 system, Noah said. The colony that the Theron Val's regional forces have been moving toward. What is the colony's current situation? Yilin said, 1,700 people. Single evacuation vessel on station, capacity 400. If the Theron Val's regional forces continue on their current vector, they reach the colony in approximately 40 hours. The compact observer ships are in the system. The observer ships have no evacuation capacity and no defensive capability. The Sarathvel's military response, Noah said. Their nearest capable force is 60 hours away, Yilin said. They are aware. They have requested assistance through the compact's mediation channel. The mediation channel is transmitting the request. The compact's Collective Security Directorate is convening to assess the request, which will take. How long? Noah said. The Directorate's standard assessment timeline for a military authorization request is 72 to 96 hours, Yilin said. Noah looked at the restriction. She thought the restriction prohibits deployment. Yilin is already deployed. The restriction prohibits military assets in the conflict zone. The conflict zone is defined in the resolution as the systems in active dispute. Velsorath 7 was not in active dispute when the restriction was passed because the Theron Val forces had not yet reached it. Whether Velsorath 7 was currently in the conflict zone was a definitional question that the restriction's text did not clearly resolve. She thought, I am in the territory of the hidden joint again. She thought, the question is not whether the restriction says what I want it to say. The question is whether what I am about to do is what the situation requires and whether it can be done within a defensible reading of what the restriction actually says. She thought about 1,700 people and a 40-hour window and a compact authorization process that took 72 to 96 hours. She thought defensible is not the same as safe. Defensible means, I can explain this to the council and the explanation is honest and it holds under scrutiny. It does not mean, no one will object. It means the objection can be answered. She said to Yilin, the restriction prohibits deployment to the conflict zone. It does not prohibit the use of vessels already in the ascending corridor for humanitarian operations in systems that are not currently in the designated conflict zone. If you were in the vicinity of Vel-Sarath 7 for purposes of establishing an evacuation corridor for civilian populations, you would be in a system that was, at the time of the restriction, not in the designated conflict zone, conducting humanitarian operations, with military assets that were already deployed before the restriction took effect. Yi-Lin said, "That is the interpretation you are operating on." "That is the interpretation I am prepared to defend before the council," Noah said. "It is an honest interpretation. It is not the only possible interpretation. It is the interpretation that is consistent with the restrictions text and consistent with the humanitarian provisions of the Compact's founding documents, which Article 14 specifies take precedence over procedural restrictions in situations involving imminent civilian harm." Yi-Lin said Article 14. Article 14, Section 2, Noah said, humanitarian necessity. The provision that was in the founding documents since the beginning and that nobody has invoked in 67 years because nobody has been in a situation where invoking it was both necessary and defensible. She paused. "I am invoking it now, formally, on the record. So that when the council asks what I was doing, the answer is, operating under Article 14, Section 2, in the defense of the Compact's founding principle that civilian populations are not to be left to foreseeable harm when member species have the capability to prevent it." Yi-Lin was quiet for a moment. 700 people, she said. "Yes," Noah said. "I have 31 vessels within range of Vel-Sarath 7, Yi-Lin said. "If I move them in the next 2 hours, I can have an evacuation corridor established in 14 hours and the civilian population secured before the Theron Val regional forces reach the colony." "Move them," Noah said. Yi-Lin moved them. Noah submitted a formal notification to the Compact Council, timed to arrive simultaneously with Yi-Lin's fleet movement, because the notification and the movement had to be simultaneous for the notification to be honest rather than a post hoc justification. The notification said, "The human delegation is invoking Article 14, Section 2 of the Compact's founding documents, the humanitarian necessity provision, in the case of the civilian population of Vel-Sarath 7, the UEDF Ascending Corridor Contingent, which was deployed before the Vel-Sarath conflict restriction and is not prohibited from presence in the Ascending Corridor by the restriction's terms, is establishing a civilian evacuation corridor in the Vel-Sarath 7 system. The civilian population of 1,700 is at imminent risk from Theron Val regional forces. The Compact's authorization process timeline exceeds the available window by a factor of 2 to 3. The human delegation is taking this action transparently with formal notification on the basis of the Compact's own founding humanitarian provisions and will submit a full accounting of the action to the Council upon completion." She sent it. She sent a second notification to the Compact's Humanitarian Operations Division and the Collective Security Directorate, formally requesting retroactive authorization under Article 14, because retroactive authorization was a recognized process under the provision and requesting it transparently was the correct procedure. Then she called Vel-Enro. Vel-Enro said before she could speak, "We received the notification." "Yes," she said. Article 14, Vel-Enro said, Section 2. "Yes." A pause. "The SRI are reviewing the provision," Vel-Enro said. "We will respond when the review is complete." "I know it's an aggressive reading," she said. "I'm prepared to defend it." "You are always prepared to defend it," Vel-Enro said. "That is, the SRI note the pattern." The pattern is honesty, she said. I do things I can honestly defend and I defend them honestly. The Sori have noted this pattern correctly. Yes, Velanro said. The Sori have also noted that the pattern has a consistent outcome. Things that are honestly done on honest grounds under honest readings of the relevant texts produce outcomes that the Council finds difficult to reverse without establishing precedents that make other honest readings more available to all members. Yes, she said, that is also the pattern. The Velcon have already submitted a formal protest, Velanro said. I expect they have, she said. The Threll are assessing whether to co-sign the protest, Velanro said. They probably will, she said. The protest is legitimate. I did something that is in the gray area of the restriction. The protest is the correct response to that. The protest will go to the Council will assess Article 14, Section 2, and the Council will make a determination. That is the process. I have put the action into the process transparently because the process is what should govern it. Velanro was quiet for a moment. And if the process finds against you, Velanro said. The 1,700 people will have been evacuated, she said. The Council's finding will be about the precedent and the procedural question. The humanitarian outcome will be irreversible. That is the honest accounting of what I have done. You have prioritized the outcome over the process, Velanro said. I have operated within the process, she said. Article 14 is part of the process. It is part of the founding documents. The restriction is also part of the process. I have made a judgment about which part of the process takes precedence in this specific situation, on grounds I have been transparent about, and I have submitted to the process's determination. That is not prioritizing outcome over process. That is using all of the process, not just the part that was convenient for the 11 delegations that drafted the restriction. A long pause. The SRI review of Article 14, Section 2 is complete, Velanro said. The SRI assessment is that your reading is defensible. It is not the only reading. It is defensible. A pause. The SRI will not file a protest. Thank you, she said. The SRI are not thanking you, Velanro said. The SRI are applying the law as they assess it. The assessment happens to support your reading. This is the law working as it should. Yes, she said, I know. Yilin's fleet established the evacuation corridor in 16 hours, which was too ho. Longer than the estimate because 2 of her vessels encountered a navigational anomaly in the approach to Velsorath 7 that required adjustment. The Theron Val regional forces reached the system boundary of Velsorath 7 22 hours after Yilin's fleet arrived, which was 8 hours after the evacuation was complete. What happened when the Theron Val regional forces arrived at the Velsorath 7 system boundary was the part that nobody in the Compact Council had fully anticipated. Because the Compact Council's emergency session had focused on stopping the conflict's escalation and had not focused on what presence in the region might do to the conflict's dynamics. The Theron Val regional forces arrived at Velsorath 7 and found 31 UEDF vessels in the system in a configuration that was not hostile. The vessels were not in combat formation, were not targeting the Theron Val forces, were positioned around the colony site in a way that was clearly humanitarian rather than military. The evacuation was complete. There was nobody to harm. The colony was empty. But 31 UEDF vessels were also 31 vessels from a species that the Theron Val had no operational history with, that had arrived in the ascending corridor 6 weeks ago and had immediately demonstrated that they had a fleet, and that the fleet operated with sophisticated coordination, and that the fleet did not leave when things told it to leave. The Theron Val regional forces stopped at the system boundary. They transmitted on the compact's diplomatic frequency, which meant they had the frequency, which meant they had done their intelligence work on the compact's communications architecture, and asked, in a translation that the ascending corridor systems managed with difficulty, something that resolved as, "Who are you and what are you doing in this system?" Yilin transmitted back. She said, "We are the UEDF Ascending Corridor Contingent. We were here before you arrived. The civilian population has been evacuated for their safety. We are not hostile to your forces. We are here." The Theranval regional forces held position for 6 hours. Then they withdrew. Not because 31 vessels was an overwhelming military force relative to the Theranval regional contingent, which was larger. Because 31 vessels that were clearly not there to fight, but were also clearly not leaving represented a variable that the regional forces had not been told how to handle, and regional forces in a distributed decision-making structure, encountering variables they had not been told how to handle, defaulted to their most available instruction, which was to hold position and request guidance from central coordination. Central coordination, receiving the request from multiple regional forces simultaneously. Because Yilin's fleet was not only in Velsorath 7, the activation of the evacuation corridor had made the UEDF's presence in the ascending corridor more visible across several systems, was suddenly managing a conflict that had an unexpected element in it, and central coordination managing an unexpected element needed more time. The Sarathvel's military force arrived in the region during that time. The arrival of the Sarathvel military, combined with the UEDF presence that had already changed the Theranval regional forces' behavior in multiple systems, produced a situation that was different from the situation that had existed before the UEDF vessels moved. The situation that had existed before was Theranval regional forces advancing against a Sarathvel defensive posture that was unable to concentrate fast enough to stop them, with a compact mediation process running too slowly to matter. The situation that existed now was Theranval regional forces holding position across multiple systems while central coordination managed an unexpected variable, with the Sarathvel military force arriving into a conflict zone where the immediate pressure had paused. The ceasefire that the compact had called for in its restriction resolution, the ceasefire that had not taken effect because the Theranval's distributed structure had regional forces still moving when the resolution passed, took effect on day 2 of the UEDF presence in the region. Not because the UEDF forced it, because the pause that the UEDF's presence had created was the space in which the ceasefire could actually land. The Compact's mediation team, which had been trying for 11 months to produce a ceasefire in a conflict where neither party had sufficient incentive to pause long enough for mediation to work, received word of the ceasefire on day 2, and immediately deployed to the region to hold it in place with the procedural structure that mediation provided. By day 3, the ceasefire was in the Compact's formal record as an active agreement, with mediation protocols established. The conflict had been running for 14 months. It ended on day 3, after the UEDF moved. The Compact Council's follow-up session was not 11 minutes, it was 9 hours. The Velkon's protest was on the floor. The Threll had co-signed. 7 delegations had submitted observations, most of them on Article 14, Section 2, and whether Noah's reading of the provision was defensible. The Collective Security Directorate had submitted a retroactive authorization assessment that said, with the specific careful language of an assessment that was going to be cited in future proceedings, the Article 14, Section 2 invocation is assessed as defensible under the provision's text and consistent with its stated purpose. The Directorate notes that this assessment creates a precedent that the Council may wish to formalize through explicit provision. The Council spent 4 hours on the legal question and 3 hours on the outcomes and 2 hours on what to do next. The legal question resolved as the Collective Security Directorate's assessment stood, the action was retroactively authorized, the precedent was noted for future formalization. The outcome question produced the most extended discussion because the outcome question was not really about the Velsorath conflict, it was about what had happened. The compact had banned humanity from the war. The war had ended in 3 days without humanity fighting in it. The ending had been produced by humanity's presence changing the conflict's dynamics, which was different from fighting, which was what the restriction had been designed to prevent. The Velkon's representative said, the restriction was designed to prevent unilateral military involvement. What occurred was unilateral military involvement recharacterized as humanitarian operation. The characterization was accurate, Noah said. The evacuation was humanitarian. The presence was an existing deployment. The effect on the conflict dynamics was not the stated purpose of the action, it was a consequence. We stated the purpose, submitted to the process, and accepted the Council's authority to determine whether the action was within the restriction. The Council has determined it was. She paused. I do not dispute that the outcome was influenced by our presence. I dispute that the outcome was a violation of the restriction because the restriction addressed deployment and the outcome was produced by presence, and those are different things. The distinction between deployment and presence is, the Velkon's representative began. In the text, Noah said, the distinction is in the text of the restriction, deployment is an action, presence is a condition. The restriction prohibited the action. It did not prohibit the condition because the condition preceded the restriction. The chamber was quiet. Trelvaz, son of the Keth, said, the Keth delegation notes that the outcome of the action was 1,700 civilians evacuated, ceasefire in effect, Sarathvel population secured, mediation process engaged after 11 months of failed attempts. The Keth delegation asks, what would the outcome have been without the action? Nobody answered this. The answer was in the numbers and the timelines, and everyone in the room was capable of doing the arithmetic. Trelvaz's son said, the Keth delegation further notes that the compact's restriction was designed to prevent a member species from unilaterally escalating a conflict. The human action did not escalate the conflict. It produced a pause that allowed the conflict to de-escalate. The compact has a word for what the human action was, and that word is not in the restriction because the restriction did not anticipate this category of action. The word is interposition. The compact's own military doctrine manual uses this term to describe the placement of a force between combatants for the purpose of creating a pause rather than achieving a military objective. The restriction prohibited military objectives. Interposition is a different category. The chamber processed this. The SRI submitted a formal note that said, the SRI delegation notes that the compact's military doctrine manual was drafted 61 years ago and has not been substantially updated. The SRI recommendation is that the update include explicit treatment of interposition as a doctrine category distinct from military engagement, for use in future guidance. The motion that passed at the session's end, by a vote of 13-3 with 2 abstentions, was not a censure and not an endorsement. It was an instruction to the compact's legal and military doctrine divisions to formalize the Article 14, Section 2 provisions, define interposition as a distinct operational category, and develop guidelines for when each was applicable. The motion explicitly noted that the action in the Velsorath conflict would be used as a case study. The Velkon and the Threll voted against. One of the 3 delegations who had recently been part of the majority for the Article 23 ultimatum also voted against. The other 8 of the 11 who had signed the ultimatum voted for the motion. Noah noted this. She noted it the way she noted all things that were information, as data about positions that were available and positions that were not, data she would use in the working group on security architecture that was now in its 4th month and that was producing slowly the kind of document that governance frameworks produced when they were being genuinely revised rather than cosmetically updated. After the session in the corridor, she stood with Velonro and Trelvaz's son, which was a combination that had not happened before and that felt to her like something that was taking a shape. Trelvaz's son said, "Interposition." "Yes," she said. "The form that does not leave," Trelvaz's son said, "applied at the compact governance level." She thought about Yilin Okonkwo, who had held position for 11 hours against the Kelvon because there was a colony behind her. She thought about Yilin Okonkwo establishing an evacuation corridor because there were 1,700 people in a 40-hour window and the authorization process took 72. She thought about the form that does not leave, and what it looked like when it was applied not in the Kelvon standoff but in a conflict between two non-compact species in the outer ascending corridor. When the UEDF was already there and the evacuation corridor was the thing that could be done, and the ceasefire was the thing that the pause made possible. She thought we did not end that war, the ceasefire ended it. The mediation held it. The Sarathvel's military presence and the Theron Val's central coordination and the Compact's mediation process all contributed. We created the pause. The pause was the thing we could offer. The offer of the accurate thing, which in this case was not a statement about what we were but an action that was consistent with what we are. The form that does not leave, extended to mean the form that places itself between harm and the people in its path and refuses to be moved until the pause is established and the mediation can do its work. She thought that is what we are, the form that creates the pause, not always, not in every situation, but in this one and in the Kelvon contact and at the Dreshkin encounter and in 40 years of compact governance proceedings. The pause, the space, the presence that changes the dynamic by being there and staying. Velonro said, "The working group." "Yes," she said. "The security architecture revision," Velonro said, "the interposition doctrine, the Article 14 formalization, the case study. A pause. The SRI assessment is that the working group is producing something the compact has needed for 67 years and has not had the occasion to build until now." "Because the occasion wasn't there," she said. "Because the species that would build it wasn't there," Velonro said. "Not until 67 years ago. And the species that was there needed 67 years to build the understanding of the rooms before it could build what the rooms needed." She looked at the corridor. She thought about her grandmother, 26 years of learning rooms. She thought about herself, 6 years as ambassador plus 20 years before that in the ascending corridor's diplomatic infrastructure, the specific and unglamorous work of building governance frameworks in a developing region. She thought about all of it as preparation, not for the sessions, not for the votes, but for the moment when the rooms needed something built in them that required understanding them from the inside. She thought the 67 years was not waiting. The 67 years was the preparation. Every notebook and every compact session and every committee meeting and every protocol read and every language learned in a detention facility at 5:10 in the morning. All of it was the preparation for the moment when the rooms needed a framework that could hold interposition and humanitarian necessity, and the form that does not leave as a single architecture. She thought we are building it now. She thought that is the answer to the archive's question, not what we are, what we become. The species that builds the framework that the galaxy needs because we understand the rooms well enough to know what the rooms are missing. She thought, we are not there yet, we are building toward it, the building is the direction. She opened her notebook. She wrote, the war ended in 3 days, we did not fight it, we created the pause was what was needed. The framework for when pause is the action, this is what we build next. She looked at what she had written. She added, grandmother would say, learn the room. We are learning the room is the galaxy. She closed the notebook. She went to find the next meeting.